There were 300 people in my year group at secondary school. And the only place that we could fit to sit exams was in our vast assembly hall. Students would line up in rows all along the floor of the hall and along the raised stage area. And at the front of the stage area were two huge forward-facing clocks. They were big enough for all of the students to be able to see. So there were approximately 295 students sat down at their desks, anxiously awaiting the start of their maths exam. My name is called. I walk up the stairs, approach my seat, and I realize I'm stuck. There's not enough room between the back of the clock and the back of my chair for me to be able to fit. So at this point, I have two options. Option number one, forgo a brief moment of embarrassment, ask a member of staff to rearrange some furniture so that I can sit down. Or number two, breathe in and hope for the best. It transpires, however, that no amount of breathing in and hoping for the best is going to let me fit between the chair and the clock. The clock falls to the floor, narrowly avoiding a front desk of students who were probably expecting a nasty surprise that day, but more in the form of a challenging algebra question than furniture hurtling towards their face. My name is Rachel Vogler. I'm a 21-year-old undergraduate student here at Central, and my body has never fit. So at the crux of this story lies a sentiment that's actually deeply troubling. Namely, we've managed to construct a consensus that says women's bodies need to be a certain size in order to fit in to public space. When they don't fit, we've stigmatized them. We've stigmatized fatness. We've labeled it unworthy, lazy, grotesque. We've boxed it up, and we've pushed it far away from our national conscience. Now, actually, most of us are complicit in a culture that berates women for taking up space. Sounds harsh, bear with me. For as long as I can remember, I have taken up a lot of space. In fact, I'm pretty sure the only time I was an acceptable size was near my exit from the womb, and since I've occupied space way greater than that of my perceived deserving. I've watched my body grow and my skin stretch at a rate I can't control, and I've got marks all over my hips and my breasts to prove it. And as my body grew, so diminished my confidence. And in some darker times, I made one truly loyal companion. Shame and I were best friends. Really, we did everything together. We particularly enjoyed birthday parties, barbecues, crowded spaces. Shame and I trod a path that wasn't necessarily unique. Actually, it's a path that a growing number of young women are treading. It's the one that goes from the eating disorder clinic to the doctor's surgery, to the fridge, and back again, time and time over. And it wasn't that Shame and I didn't know our place. We did know our place. It wasn't in public. You see, as long as Shame and I could be pitied, we were doing fat right. We were the reason you work out fat. Fat and shameful, fat and unhappy. This is bad fat. And a few years down the line, when Shame and I made a change, we were doing it right then too. See, instead of exclusively being fat and unhappy, we became the fat woman desperately trying not to be fat anymore. Now, this is not fat and happy. This is the fat woman in a transition state trying to get from before to after. And this is good fat. Now, people absolutely love good fat. Seriously, when Shame and I started going to the gym twice a day, every day, when Shame and I started obsessively restricting our eating, people praised us, applauded us. It remains true then, and it is true now, that being the fat woman trying not to be fat anymore is one of the most respectable ventures that you can buy into. So flash forward, and as so many people do, I plateaued. And as, according to an article in the New York Times, 95% of people who diet do, I put on all the weight I had lost, and more, and more, and more. And on the morning of my 21st birthday, the supposed long-awaited dawning of new womanhood, I wake up in the morning and I realize I'm still fat. And so for the first time in my life, I choose the radical. I decide to commit to investing time and energy into radically shifting my perception of myself and of my body. And in doing so, I buy into some kind of underground movement called happy fat. Happy fat is, understandably, a state that a lot of people find confusing. So let us understand why. We're used, generally, to being able to sort the fat people that we encounter into two distinct categories. They are good fat and bad fat. Now, I've mentioned them both earlier, but let's look at them in a little bit more detail now. Bad fat needs pity in order to thrive. Bad fat is a drain on the National Health Service, a drain on the state. Bad fat can probably be found sat on the sofa, smoking a cigarette, waiting for the next benefit pack to roll around, or maybe crying in front of the fridge. Bad fat is probably your worst nightmare. And then there's good fat. Good fat is visibly engaged in attempts not to be fat anymore. Now, these attempts are probably costly, and they are probably failing. Good fat does things like not order dessert in a restaurant, and as such, she is commendable, respectable fat. Now, it doesn't actually matter what good fat does at home, right? Because as long as she is committed to the public suppression of her appetite, she is easier to perceive as a valuable member of society. Happy fat, then, is a rejection of stigmatized fat. And it's not an end game as much as it is a state. In fact, happy fat is a state of being that occurs once I admit to myself, I have been fat, I am fat, I will be fat, and there's very little that I'm doing about it. Also a decision that a lot of people find confusing. Now, the past 18 months for me can be marked by a series of observations that I've made about how I figure myself into the world as a fat woman and how the world sees me. And I'd like to share with you 3 of those main observations, followed by 3 small steps that I took to try and honor my body in the best way possible. So, observation number 1 is space. Now, I'd like you to do something for me for a second, if that's okay. Think about your past week. Think about some of the times that you might have spent walking down the street. Now, it's likely that you were involved in a scenario that plays out a little like this. You're walking down the street in one direction, minding your own business. And in the distance, you see someone else, probably a man, sorry, it's true, walking towards you. And as they come closer, it becomes increasingly obvious that this person has zero intention of moving out of the way. And at the inevitable point of meeting, what do? You probably shift to the side. You probably look at the floor. Maybe you say sorry. And as you continue your journey, maybe that happens to you a second time, a third time. Maybe when you're on the tube on the way in this morning, you folded your arms, or you crossed your legs, or you pushed up against the glass. You said sorry, you excused yourself out of existence in order to accommodate somebody else. Now, the street scenario and the tube scenario are 2 of the clearest ways that we can understand that the taking up of space is disproportionate. It's also not merely visual, right? It's gendered and it's political. And actually, both the tube scenario and the street scenario are some of the most frequent manifestations of the rhetoric that women are fed from all angles all their lives. The rhetoric that says you must squeeze and squish and fold and say sorry and be polite whilst doing so. And so then when I, or you, or we excuse ourselves out of space with a sorry or an excuse me or an is there room for me and my big bum there? Every time we do that, we in some small way consent to the notion that we deserve less space, that we are in some way worthy of preemptively being thought of that way, and of course, we know that's not true. And so step one seemed more logical. Step one is embracing a mentality that lets me exist without apology. And basically, I wanted to see what it would be like to pretend that this whole space debacle wasn't a norm. So I walked down the street a couple of times and didn't move out the way when someone was coming towards me. Causes confusion, and also there's quite a lot of me to accommodate, so that makes for a truly fascinating visual. And sure, this isn't revolutionary. But what small steps like these start to do is account for the fact that there are women who refuse to apologize for themselves, for their bodies, and for the space they take up. And honestly, this is just scratching the surface of the space conversation. So observation 2, I want to tackle something small, and that is dieting. Right, so it seems that most of the Western world is fixated on ensuring that women buy into this rhetoric we talked about before, but perpetuated in the most insidious way possible. And diet culture is so insidious that we don't even have to look for it before it finds us. It's everywhere. In television advertising campaigns, you know that Diet Coke one with the puppet ladies in the fridge? It's in diet pill packaging. It's in magazines and on billboards. And what does diet culture do? It tells us that we can have a happier life for £20 and 2 meal replacement shakes a day. Diet culture literally traps us into paying for a life in which happiness is directly correlated to the smallest amount of body mass that exists in physical space. And it's a culture, by the way, that according to an article sent out by Common Sense Media, absorbs 80% of 10-year-old girls. And so step 2 seemed more tricky. But maybe resistance to diet culture partly manifests in the unapologetic loving of food. So for me, it meant that I would try to relinquish the shame that consumed me every time I made the decision to consume in public. And life's good now. I can eat my sandwich on the tube. I can order dessert in a restaurant without having to pretend that it hadn't previously crossed my mind. No awkward laughs, no sideways glances, just dessert. So step 2 is essentially about learning to embrace appetite after only knowing to publicly suppress it for so long. So for observation 3, I'll talk briefly about fat fashion. Now, one of the things that I'd like to say about fat fashion is that it's remarkably different to the societal perception of fashion for fat women, the golden rule of which is you must dress as though you aren't fat anymore. And as such, a lot of plus-size fashion tips are founded on the premise that the only thing that you should want to do with a fat body is conceal it. Now, I've cried in enough changing rooms to know that there are few items of clothing in this world worth doubting your self-worth for. And the ones that are, I can't afford anyway. So we are currently operating in a context that renders full and unashamed self-love as radical. And I say, great. Maybe, at least right now, we need it to be, so that the energy that we are putting into creating this shift can be noticed. Now, the shift that I'm talking about isn't just one of perception. It's one of ownership, too. It's the public and personal reclamation of the right to love and honor your body for ourselves and for generations of young women for whom loving and knowing themselves can be a matter of life and death. What does the other side of the shift look like? It looks like the full embrace of diverse-bodied women. It looks like greater visibility. It looks like the rapid end to using photos of fat women as inspiration. And it sounds distinctly like less apologies. So there are lots of things that the fat girl doesn't get told. And so from the fat girl to a room of diverse-bodied people, I would like you to know this. It might be true that we can't change the traits that people attach to our bodies. But what we can change is the investment of our emotional resources, from fear and hatred and self-loathing to full, deep, radical self-love. And if, however bizarrely, self-love is radical, the shift is too. Thank you.